On the morning of October 12, 2011, just after 7 a.m., Samuel Hartley stepped out of his white clapboard house wearing his usual navy windbreaker, a wool cap, and the soft-soled shoes his daughter had bought him the previous spring. He moved slowly but purposefully, cane in hand, the way he always did, tracing the sidewalk along Maple Avenue toward the wooded trail by the river, a path he had walked nearly every morning for over 30 years. The air was crisp and dry, leaves underfoot brittle and scattered, the river mist just beginning to lift from the surface. Margaret, his wife of 49 years, was already preparing tea when he left. She didn't look up, didn't call after him. There had never been a reason to. Samuel always returned before breakfast, sometimes with a pocket full of smooth stones or a weathered story about what he'd seen. An egret in the shallows, a squirrel's nest dislodged by the wind, tracks in the mud that looked almost human. But on that morning, something shifted, quietly and without witness. By 8:30, he hadn't returned. By 9 o'clock, she was calling his name from the porch, unsure whether to feel worried or embarrassed. By noon, a neighbor had joined the search, and by 2 p.m., the town's small police department was contacted. Officers arrived quickly, respectful but relaxed at first. After all, this wasn't a bustling city. People didn't just disappear here. They checked the river path, assuming perhaps he had tripped or sat down somewhere. The banks were undisturbed. No skid marks, no displaced rocks, no torn clothing or signs of a fall. The trail cameras installed for wildlife monitoring hadn't triggered at all that morning, something that puzzled the town's game warden. Searchers expanded the perimeter, calling out Samuel's name through the thinning woods, brushing aside undergrowth and checking every culvert and brush line. Dogs were brought in by late afternoon, noses to the damp ground, handlers hopeful. But within 3 hours, the dogs lost the scent. The trail ended not far from where it began. There were no footprints leading into the river, no drag marks, no signs of panic. It was as if the air had swallowed him. By the following morning, search and rescue teams from the county joined in. They scoured the riverbanks, sent divers into the slow-moving water, even brought in sonar equipment to check for deep holes or sunken debris that might conceal a body. Still, nothing. No jacket, no hat, no cane. Helicopters circled overhead, combing fields and tree lines. The woods were methodically gridded off and searched again and again. Samuel Hartley had vanished with terrifying efficiency, and for the first time in living memory, the town of Brighton Falls found itself gripped by a mystery it couldn't explain. Neighbors gathered at the Hartleys' home over the next few days. Margaret sat in silence most of the time, staring out at the porch steps. Samuel's shoes remained by the door, his reading glasses still resting beside the morning paper he hadn't touched. Volunteers plastered missing person flyers at every gas station, grocery store, and post office. Some residents swore they'd seen him, near the park, near the old grain mill, but none of the sightings held up under scrutiny. Tips came in, but they were vague. One caller from 2 towns over claimed to have seen a man matching his description boarding a bus, but no one matching Samuel's name or physical description had purchased a ticket that day. Even so, officers checked security footage. The man on the tape was younger and moved too easily. It wasn't him. Theories began to circulate, some grounded in logic, others more sinister. Maybe he wandered off in a moment of confusion and succumbed to exposure. Maybe he fell and was covered by debris. Maybe he was taken. Some whispered about a reclusive man who lived upstream, a known eccentric who rarely left his cabin. Others wondered about the nearby quarry, now abandoned with its rusted equipment and deep water pits. The police kept logs of every suggestion. Each theory was explored, documented, and ultimately discarded. Over time, search efforts slowed, posters faded, attention turned elsewhere, but not for the family. Samuel's daughter, Lydia, returned from Connecticut and refused to believe her father was just gone. She met with detectives weekly, kept a journal of every possible lead, even hired a private investigator when the official case stalled. She begged the sheriff's department to reopen search areas, argued that something had been missed. Her brother Thomas withdrew. He stopped visiting Brighton Falls altogether, the pain of returning without closure too sharp. Margaret kept walking to the porch every morning at 7 a.m., staring down the road as if expecting to see him appear out of the mist like nothing had happened. And through all of it, the river remained quiet, cold, unmoving. It had been there the whole time, winding through the woods with deceptive calm. People walked past it every day. Children played near its edges. But for those who knew what had been lost, it became something else, no longer a source of peace, but a place marked by absence. For years it remained that way, a still witness to a moment no one saw, holding something it refused to give back. The case remained open but dormant. No arrests, no new leads, just pages in a file cabinet and a name etched into the community's memory, repeated less often but never forgotten. Samuel Hartley, age 72, missing without trace, last seen walking toward the river on a quiet October morning, a man who simply vanished into thin air. And for 11 years, no one knew what really happened after that final step. The investigation that followed Samuel Hartley's disappearance was methodical, exhaustive, and, in the end, deeply frustrating for everyone involved. Within the first 72 hours, authorities treated the case as a high-priority missing person, given Samuel's age and vulnerability. His home was the first place examined. Officers photographed every room, scanned for signs of a break-in or foul play, but nothing was out of place. His wallet and keys were still on the hallway table, breakfast dishes untouched, and no signs of a struggle or theft were evident. Margaret confirmed there had been no visitors the previous evening, no unusual calls or notes left behind. It was as though he had simply walked out the front door and dissolved into the morning air. Patrols canvassed the neighborhood and combed through the footage from a single municipal CCTV camera that faced a nearby intersection. It caught Samuel's familiar silhouette heading toward the river trail just after 7:10 a.m., then nothing. He didn't appear again. No other cameras along the riverside had a line of sight. The next phase of the search turned outward. Local hospitals and urgent care clinics were contacted, not just in Brighton Falls, but in neighboring towns as well. Police circulated Samuel's photo and medical records, hoping someone might recognize an elderly man brought in confused or unconscious. Homeless shelters, churches, and senior centers were contacted daily for a week. Flyers were posted on community boards and in waiting rooms. Officers even checked into nursing homes on the off chance that he'd been admitted under the wrong name. But there wasn't a single credible match. Attention turned to the river itself. Hydrologists from the county provided input, warning that sudden cold water immersion could cause a silent drowning, fast and nearly invisible. Divers were brought in again to check deeper pockets near the bend in the trail, and sonar teams scanned the deeper stretches. But the river yielded no clothing, no cane, not even a shoe. Teams used long poles to probe through submerged brush and overhangs, focusing on flood-prone culverts and log jams where bodies might become trapped. Nothing surfaced. Early autumn had brought steady rainfall, but there had been no record of significant flooding at the time. Water levels were normal. Still, some believed he may have slipped, hit his head, and been swept away. Others, including seasoned search and rescue volunteers, found that scenario less convincing. Samuel was cautious, especially near the water. Friends and neighbors were interviewed extensively. Most described him as sharp, lucid, and predictable. He walked the same path every morning, kept to a routine, and was not known to wander. A few mentioned that he had spoken curiously about the river over the years, that he watched it closely, always noticing how its course seemed to shift subtly over the seasons. One neighbor recalled Samuel once saying the river had a memory, that it hid things if you weren't careful. At the time, it sounded like the harmless musings of an old man. But in hindsight, it felt eerie. He had no history of mental illness, no signs of dementia. Yet, the statement lingered. As days turned to weeks, the lack of progress weighed heavily on both police and the community. Some residents developed their own theories, some logical, others conspiratorial. One group believed Samuel had wandered into the woods, become disoriented, and succumbed to exposure. But the dogs had picked up no scent past the trailhead. Others whispered about strangers seen near the river in the days prior, or the possibility that Samuel had been abducted. A few blamed the town's transient workers or drifters. These whispers only grew louder as time passed without resolution. A woman swore she'd seen an older man matching Samuel's description in a neighboring town a week later, but the man turned out to be someone else entirely. Another man claimed Samuel had entered a white pickup truck early that morning, an account that couldn't be verified. Investigators began compiling everything: maps of the trail system, satellite images of the riverbank before and after the disappearance, logs of interviews, timestamps, tip lines, phone records. Nothing conclusive emerged. Search dogs were deployed again after a dry spell, hoping for better conditions, but their initial trails faded abruptly a few hundred feet into the trail. It was as if he had simply walked into a fold in the earth and never come back out. As the weeks became months, the case cooled. The family still followed up relentlessly, but the leads went stale. Volunteers thinned out, the posters weathered in the wind, faded by sun and rain, clinging to power poles like ghosts. The river path remained open, but its quiet charm was gone. People walked it with unease, their eyes drawn to the edges of the current, as though expecting something to surface. A kind of collective discomfort settled in, a low-grade dread that someone could vanish without trace in broad daylight. Samuel Hartley's name became a fixture in local conversation, not in anger or urgency, but as a cautionary tale. By the end of the first year, the search had produced no arrests, no remains, no personal effects, and no plausible timeline that explained how a man of his age and health could vanish within a few hundred yards of his front door. The case file was thick, over 400 pages, but its contents painted no picture, only absence. The town carried on, but that quiet weight remained. Samuel's disappearance had become a shadow that moved with everyone, particularly those who lived near the water. And as time went on, that shadow didn't fade. It deepened, turning the unexplained into the unbearable. In the months following Samuel Hartley's disappearance, the weight of uncertainty settled into the Hartley household like damp air that refused to lift. Margaret, once steady and composed, began to unravel in quiet, imperceptible ways. She stopped preparing 2 cups of tea in the morning. The porch chair Samuel always used remained empty, though she kept brushing fallen leaves off its seat as if expecting him to return at any moment. Every knock on the door, every phone ring, sent a jolt through her chest, a surge of fragile hope that died just as quickly when it was only a neighbor, a delivery, or worse, silence. She kept his shoes by the front door, refused to wash the clothes he left folded in the laundry basket, and continued to wind his watch each night, convinced that time, somehow, could be preserved until he came home. Their daughter Lydia spiraled in a different direction. Racked with guilt, she played back every recent interaction with her father, analyzing his voice for clues, replaying conversations she now feared had hidden meanings. She regretted not walking with him more, not insisting he take his phone, not checking in that morning. She returned to Brighton Falls and moved into her childhood bedroom, the walls now filled with maps and notepads, copies of police records, and timelines she built on her own. She wrote to anyone who would listen, missing persons networks, journalists, retired detectives. She questioned witnesses again, retraced the Riverwalk with volunteers, and hired a private investigator out of state when the local one stopped returning her calls. She grew thin, tired, but relentless. Her obsession became a coping mechanism. If she kept moving, kept asking, she wouldn't have to face the unbearable truth that there was nothing left to find. Thomas, the younger sibling, dealt with it differently. He distanced himself, emotionally and physically. Calls with his mother became less frequent. He cited work, stress, the distance from his own family. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't bear it. The helplessness, the endless questions, the image of his father simply vanishing haunted him. He avoided the river entirely on his rare visits, walking the long way around to avoid seeing the bend where Samuel had last been seen. He told himself it was pointless to keep looking, that if there was something to be found, it would have been discovered already. But deep down, he blamed himself too, blamed them all for treating his father's routine as invincible. Occasionally, rumors would resurface. People in town claimed to have seen a man walking the trail early in the morning, dressed in an old Navy jacket moving slowly through the mist. Once, a teenager posted online about seeing a man sitting alone on the rocks by the riverbank, staring at the water. By the time anyone went to check, the figure was gone. Margaret collected these stories like loose change, useless but impossible to throw away. Lydia chased some of them, even ones that made no sense. The hope never fully died. It just changed shape. The private investigator they hired followed every routine angle, cross-checked Samuel's bank accounts, monitored for identity fraud, checked travel records and license plate readers on highways. Nothing. He had simply disappeared from a 1-mile walking loop less than half a mile from his front door. The PI noted one thing that unsettled Margaret. The same stretch of river where Samuel vanished had been the site of 2 other missing persons cases in the early 90s. Both had been dismissed as runaways or accidental drownings. No pattern had been established. Still, the mention stuck with her. As time passed, the town's attention drifted. Other stories took its place. The volunteers stopped coming. The police stopped calling. Tips dried up. Reporters who had once sat at Margaret's kitchen table stopped answering emails. The case was still open, but in name only. The family was left in a quiet kind of isolation, surrounded by neighbors who didn't know what to say anymore. Sympathy turned to distance. Conversations turned elsewhere. The world moved forward, but the Hartleys remained anchored to that morning in October. Even within their home, time split in two. There was before, and there was after. Margaret often walked to the edge of the river now, alone, standing at the curve where the path thinned and the trees thickened. She said nothing, just stared. She never walked too close to the water, but she never left without looking for something, anything that might still be his. A glint of metal, a scrap of fabric, a sound, but there was only the wind and the rush of water over stone. Still, she felt it, his presence, not as a ghost, but as something unfinished, like a question waiting to be answered. The same feeling Lydia described in her dreams, where her father would appear across the river, standing silently with his back to her, just far enough that she could never reach him. It was grief, everyone said. It was unresolved trauma. But it felt like more than that. It felt like Samuel Hartley had never truly left, like he was still there, somewhere between the trees and the river, just beyond sight, waiting. And for 11 years, that feeling would never fade. As the search for Samuel Hartley stretched from months into years, the river, once considered thoroughly examined, began to take on a different kind of weight in the investigation. What was initially viewed as a serene background to the disappearance began to feel like an active participant in it, something indifferent, evasive, and complex. With no signs of foul play and no evidence of voluntary disappearance, attention gradually returned to the natural environment itself. It was Samuel's last known destination, the only thing that made sense, if anything still could. The family began consulting experts on river behavior, hoping the answers might lie not in theory or malice, but in physics and terrain. Hydrologists and geologists brought in by the Hartleys introduced terms the family had never heard before: hyperheic exchange zones, subsurface entrapment, scouring pools. The experts explained how rivers evolve constantly, that even calm, shallow waters can contain deep hidden pockets where silt builds and collapses, unpredictably. Some of these features, they said, could conceal a body indefinitely, particularly in cold temperatures where decomposition slows to a crawl. One report suggested that during seasonal changes, currents might shift sediment in such a way that a person, or what remained of them, could be repeatedly buried and uncovered over time without ever surfacing. The early search efforts, though diligent, hadn't accounted for all of these nuanced hydrodynamic processes. Fishermen along the riverbank spoke about sudden changes in the water's movement, times when new sandbars would appear overnight and then vanish within weeks. They described snags where large tree branches had embedded into the bank, trapping debris and creating whirlpools, some just inches below the surface. One longtime angler claimed that after a particularly heavy rain in 2016, he pulled in a boot filled with mud and something resembling cloth. He'd thrown it back, spooked and unsure. That story made its way back to Lydia, who then arranged for that entire stretch to be re-scanned with sonar equipment. Again, the river gave nothing up. Amateur divers from a nearby town volunteered during the drier months when the water was clearer and shallower. With GoPros strapped to their heads, they documented each dive, reviewing the footage for abnormalities. They found rusted bicycles, a sunken ATV, even a pair of dentures lodged in a submerged tree stump, but nothing connected to Samuel. The mud was thick and black in most places. Any soft object would vanish into it within days. Visibility below 2 feet was poor. They estimated that without a weighted line or anchor, even experienced divers could drift yards off course and miss something entirely. Still, they tried, each time returning with new questions and more mud-caked gear, but no resolution. Old rumors added another layer to the mystery. Brighton Falls had once been a logging hub, decades before Samuel's retirement. Locals recalled stories of heavy equipment, logs, and even makeshift rafts being lost to the river during the peak of transport seasons in the 1950s and 60s. Some believed remnants of those operations, metal cables, sunken pilings, and disused dams, still existed beneath the silt. A few pointed to an abandoned floodgate system about a mile downstream, a place where sediment built up unnaturally and animals were sometimes found trapped after strong storms. The site had never been properly dredged or mapped. Margaret insisted that area be examined, but volunteers who ventured that far found nothing but tangles of overgrowth, broken machinery, and rot. Each search, each analysis, each theory added to the strange and growing portrait of the river, not as a passive landscape, but as a dynamic, deceptive, and potentially complicit entity. It didn't need intent to hide a person. It just needed time, depth, and silence. In late 2019, a volunteer team from a university used ground-penetrating radar along one particularly unstable bend. The scans revealed irregular subsurface structures, likely compacted logs or collapsed embankments. The patterns were curious, but without more funding or permits, nothing could be excavated. Lydia petitioned for additional searches, but the town had moved on. Her requests were met with polite sympathy and little action. Still, the Hartleys persisted. On days when the tide receded and the river narrowed, they walked its banks with notepads and measuring tape, marking subtle changes. They recorded drone footage from above, trying to spot patterns in the sand ridges that lined the edge like veins. The family built their own map, an evolving annotated record of the river's transformation over the years, noting where rocks shifted, where logs surfaced, and where the water always seemed darkest. And yet, nothing ever stayed long enough to study. The river changed constantly. It never looked the same twice. The hardest part was how plausible it all became. Not because it made sense emotionally, but because it didn't have to. Nature didn't need motive. The river could have taken him, buried him, kept him hidden for years without offering a single clue. That possibility became a kind of slow, creeping grief in itself, not the grief of violence or crime, but the grief of being undone by something so impersonal. A step too close, a soft patch of mud, a sudden drop. No scream, no witness, just silence and water. The river, once a place of quiet ritual in Samuel's daily life, had become the family's last suspect. And the longer it held its silence, the more that suspicion began to feel like truth. By the time October returned to Brighton Falls for the 11th time since Samuel Hartley vanished, something in the air felt different. The anniversary, usually marked by quiet grief and fading community memory, was overshadowed by increasingly urgent weather reports. Meteorologists began tracking an unusually volatile storm system brewing over the western counties, an unstable mix of pressure fronts and saturated soil conditions that could bring record-breaking rainfall to the valley. The river that had once swallowed a man whole was now forecast to rise well beyond its usual margins. Warnings were issued 2 days in advance. Local authorities urged evacuations near the lower banks and encouraged residents to stay indoors, brace windows, and prepare for flash flooding. But for the Hartley family, and for a small group of townspeople who had never truly stopped thinking about Samuel, the storm felt like something more than a hazard. It felt like a reckoning. Margaret sat in her armchair watching the radar coverage, her hands clutching the hem of a blanket she hadn't washed since the day Samuel disappeared. Lydia returned home the night before the storm hit. She didn't say it out loud, but Margaret understood why. Something about the timing stirred a dormant sense of urgency neither of them could explain. The weather, violent and erratic, made the entire region feel unstable. Rain fell in heavy sheets, driving sideways in wind gusts that snapped tree limbs and sent trash cans skidding down the streets. But it was the river they watched most closely. From their back porch window, the current was no longer slow and predictable. It surged and snarled like an uncoiled rope, slapping violently against its banks and peeling away the edges of the landscape with each passing hour. Downstream, the water clawed at the soft silt deposits and exposed long-buried roots. Trees that had stood for decades began to lean at odd angles. Rocks shifted, trails collapsed, and entire patches of shoreline crumbled into the current. Locals described hearing low groans from the earth, like something deep below the surface was being dislodged. Some of the older residents remembered storms like this, decades ago, but none with this particular tension. Even those who had grown tired of the Hartley story began to feel something stir. Not guilt, not belief, but a sense that the river had never finished what it started. When the storm finally passed 36 hours later, the sky hung low and bruised. Power lines dangled over flooded intersections, branches littered the streets, and the air smelled of wet soil and snapped pine. But more than that, the river had changed. It no longer looked familiar. The path Samuel had once walked was gone, replaced by a jagged scar of collapsed trail and scattered debris. A shallow sandbar had formed near the bend, where the first search dogs lost his scent. Only now it was twice as long and covered in twisted roots and unidentifiable fragments. Volunteers, some from out of town, returned instinctively. They walked cautiously along the edges, testing the mud with poles and marking new points of erosion. A few local men and waders moved into the shallows, pushing aside branches and stones, their expressions unsure of what they were hoping to find. The Hartleys arrived late in the afternoon, walking slowly down the sloped embankment in rubber boots, their faces pale from a decade of waiting. Lydia clutched a folder of old maps, comparing where the water used to be with where it had carved out new paths. As the group scanned the altered terrain, something about the scene felt uneasy. A rusted metal pipe that hadn't been visible in years now protruded at an odd angle from the soil. Around it, sediment had been peeled back in swirling ridges, exposing thin layers of dark organic matter. Someone pointed out what looked like the edge of a wooden plank, too old and soft to identify clearly. Another noticed how the curve of the new bank lined up almost perfectly with the spot Samuel was last seen. The tension among them grew as the weight of possibility settled into the silence. No one spoke of discovery, not yet. But there was something there, something that hadn't been there before. That night, back at the house, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat by the kitchen window, watching the river glint under the moonlight. It no longer whispered like it used to. It churned, as if agitated, as if, for the first time in 11 years, it had grown tired of keeping its secrets. Lydia stood behind her, map in hand, the spot circled in red where the river's anatomy had been rewritten. There were no guarantees. There never had been. But after all the years of silence, all the dead ends, the river had finally shifted. Something had been stirred, something ancient and long concealed, and in the coming days, someone would find it. Or perhaps it would find them. 2 days after the storm cleared, with much of the town still drying out and assessing damage, a local kayaker named Jared Collins pushed off from a side dock just north of Brighton Falls, hoping to survey the river's altered shape while the waters were still unusually low. He knew the bends well, had fished and floated those waters for years. But something about the sharp curve near the southern trail caught his eye. Along a newly formed sandbank, the soil had collapsed in uneven patterns, and near the base of a shallow ridge, Something rigid protruded slightly above the surface. At first, he assumed it was a tree root or perhaps twisted scrap from a flood-damaged dock, but as he drifted closer, a more unsettling shape came into focus, rounded, pale, partially tangled in silt and leaves. Without disembarking, he snapped a few photos on his phone and paddled back upstream. By dusk, local police had cordoned off the site. Forensic specialists, divers, and a medical examiner arrived the next morning. The body was lodged deep within a soft sediment pocket, partially preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor water and insulated under layers of decaying plant matter. Removing it required surgical precision to avoid damaging the fragile remains. Beneath the surface, the area was darker and more viscous than anticipated, trapping not just the body, but a trail of surrounding organic debris that had settled undisturbed for over a decade. Over hours, they carefully freed what they could see, then fanned out to search for personal effects. A partial wallet was recovered, barely intact, a cracked pair of wire-frame glasses, and a cane, broken at the midshaft, resting parallel to the body's left side as though it had been carried down with him, then pinned by the current. Back at the lab, dental records confirmed the identity. Samuel Hartley had been found. After 11 years, the mystery that had hung over the town like a quiet fog had a name again. Not just a file, not just a poster. The shock rippled fast. Lydia received the call first. Margaret was sitting in the kitchen, quietly folding a dish towel when her daughter told her. There was no scream, no collapse, just a soft inhale, her hands trembling slightly, as if her body was already somewhere far away, bracing itself for news it had always expected, but never fully imagined. The forensic report explained what no one had been able to for more than a decade. Based on the positioning of the remains, Samuel had likely slipped or lost footing near the river's edge during his walk. But instead of landing in shallow water, his body was caught in a narrow eddy, an overlooked whirlpool-like depression that formed near certain river bends under specific seasonal conditions. The force would have been quiet, but forceful, pulling him downward and backward into the deeper pool, where silt and cold water preserved his remains in near stasis. For 11 years, he had been resting just beneath the surface, in a part of the river scanned early on, but dismissed due to then incomplete models of the riverbed. The state pathologist noted the rare preservation state. Enough soft tissue remained for partial reconstruction, aided by the uniquely low oxygen microclimate in that river pocket. There were no signs of trauma, no fractures inconsistent with drowning, no evidence of restraint, blunt force, or foul play. The conclusion, though painful, was straightforward. Accidental death. A slip, a fall, a misstep on the edge of soft earth. The river hadn't murdered him. It had swallowed him quietly and kept him hidden. News spread through Brighton Falls faster than it had in years. People who hadn't thought of Samuel Hartley in a decade found themselves standing still mid-task, staring out windows, remembering the old man with the slow walk and warm nods. Conversations shifted, theories died. The man some thought had been abducted or fled or murdered had never left. He had been right there. The discovery came with a strange duality, relief wrapped in heartbreak. The Hartleys no longer had to wonder, but they also had to face the brutal reality that the answers had always been there, just out of reach. Margaret, in private, asked to see what was recovered, not the remains, just the glasses, just the cane. She held them for minutes without speaking, her thumb tracing the cracked frame slowly, reverently. Lydia sat beside her, both women silent, the storm still echoing in their minds. For the community, the revelation left a hole in its collective certainty. After years of building myths and theories, of whispering about what might have happened, the truth was so ordinary, so natural, it hurt in a different way. Samuel Hartley hadn't been taken by a person, but by terrain. Not a conspiracy, but a moment. One missed step, one overlooked eddy. The river had always held the answer. It had just waited for the right storm to give it back. In the weeks following the discovery of Samuel Hartley's remains, investigators shifted their focus to reconstruction, an attempt to explain how a man could vanish so completely and why no one had found him for 11 years. The local police, working in conjunction with state forensic experts, meticulously revisited every detail from that October morning in 2011. They analyzed weather, archives, topographical records, and hydrological data, cross-referencing Samuel's known walking route with floodplain simulations and erosion models that hadn't existed when the search first began. What emerged was a sobering timeline of events, one where tragedy occurred not in chaos but in silence, orchestrated entirely by the mechanics of nature. Meteorological logs confirmed that the week of Samuel's disappearance had seen slight but measurable rainfall in the days prior. It wasn't enough to trigger concern at the time, but enough to raise the river by several inches and saturate the soil near its edge. For someone with a cautious but steady gait like Samuel, that small rise, combined with decades of quiet erosion, was enough to alter the stability of the riverbank just enough to matter. The area where his body was ultimately found matched a known flood-prone bend with an unrecognized undercurrent, an eddy, shallow on the surface, but deceptively forceful below. Using drone scans taken during and after the recent storm, forensic geographers overlaid the current landscape with older trail maps from 2011. They then ran erosion simulations based on the river's historical flow rate and sediment drift. The results were chilling in their clarity. A foot placed slightly too far to the left on that particular curve could have landed in soft, waterlogged ground, a spot undermined by sediment loss below the surface. If Samuel slipped there, even slightly, the river's undertow could have caught his leg and spun him sideways, pulling him down into the narrow eddy and trapping him beneath the silt. The position in which his body was found supported that theory. He had not fallen downstream or floated far, as once believed. He had remained in almost the exact spot where the trail cameras last recorded him walking, buried under shifting layers of silt and leaf debris that compounded with every passing year. What searchers couldn't see at the time was that the eddy had created a downward spiral effect, pulling sediment into a natural depression and compacting it around him. It was a burial engineered not by intent, but by hydraulics. Over time, each seasonal flood deposited more organic matter, sealing the space like a vault. Forensic pathologists confirmed that the preservation of Samuel's body was unusually effective due to the environmental conditions within that pocket of the river: low temperature, minimal oxygen, and minimal sunlight penetration. These factors slowed decomposition and bacterial activity to such an extent that even after more than a decade, identifying markers like dental structure and soft tissue traces remained intact enough for confident identification. It was, in scientific terms, an accidental time capsule, one that no search team in 2011 had the technology or environmental models to detect. Authorities compiled their findings into a comprehensive forensic report, which they presented to the Hartley family in private. It detailed every data point, every simulation, and every logical conclusion, all pointing to a death by accidental drowning, a result of terrain instability, water level fluctuation, and timing. No signs of assault, no struggle, no injuries beyond what would be expected from a sudden fall and submersion. The report, though emotionally difficult to read, gave the Hartleys what they had not possessed for 11 years: an ending. For the town, the revelations sparked reflection. The idea that a man could disappear from a public walking trail in broad daylight, not because of violence or malicious intent, but because of a blind spot in the natural landscape, forced residents to reconsider their relationship with familiar spaces. The river, once the heart of Brighton Falls' peaceful aesthetic, now demanded a new kind of respect. Local officials began discussing improvements to trail maintenance, better signage near water-prone areas, and geological surveys to identify similar hazards. What had once been taken for granted, a bend in a river, a worn footpath, was now recognized for what it could become under the right conditions: a silent risk. Margaret Hartley read the report in full twice, line by line, and folded it away in a drawer beside Samuel's glasses and watch. Lydia placed a copy in a binder with her research notes, the red-circled maps, and the newspaper clippings she'd collected over the years. Their grief didn't disappear, but it changed shape. Now it had edges. Now it had a name. Samuel had not been taken. He had not wandered away confused. He had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, not by human design, but by the indifferent mechanical patience of a river doing what rivers do. The case was officially closed, but its lessons would linger, etched not in suspicion or blame, but in the sobering knowledge that even the most ordinary terrain can hold secrets for as long as it needs to, until time or nature decides to give them back. For the first time in 11 years, the Mallory family stood not in uncertainty, but in place. The storm had pulled back the curtain, and now Thomas was no longer just missing. He had a location, a final resting spot, something real. Local authorities arranged a controlled site visit just 3 days after the forensic recovery. The area along the riverbank had been stabilized and marked with surveyor flags. Sections of the eroded trail were cordoned off with caution tape, and muddy footprints still led down to the curved ridge where the sandbar had partially collapsed. It was here, under this newly revealed strip of earth, that Thomas Mallory had spent the last decade. Not lost in the vastness of the world, but resting quietly in the bend of the river, he'd walked every morning without fail. Margaret didn't say a word as she stepped from the marked trail to the edge of the site. Lydia walked beside her, one hand gripping a folded newspaper article, the other clutching a sweater her father had once worn. A uniformed grief counselor waited nearby but kept his distance. Margaret looked down at the soft, churned soil where his cane had been recovered, her breath caught. Then, slowly, she knelt, palms hovering over the ground as if she were afraid to touch it, as if it might vanish again. Lydia crouched beside her, and neither of them cried. There were no tears left, only stillness, only gravity, only the truth that this was where Thomas had been all along. The town's crisis response team had brought in 2 psychologists to support the family during and after the visit. They offered no platitudes, only presence, explaining that closure did not mean relief. It meant reality. It meant reorienting a story long defined by questions into one reshaped by answers. Margaret listened to them speak, but the words barely reached her. Her fingers dug lightly into the silt, and she stared at the river. It moved differently now, not like a force of concealment, but as a vessel emptied, a keeper of silence that had finally broken. News of the discovery spread fast through Brighton Falls. The local paper, which had run a piece every year on the anniversary of Thomas's disappearance, now carried a headline that read simply, "Mallory found." Neighbors left flowers along the reopened trail. Some left handwritten notes tucked into the wooden trail sign near the bend, messages of remembrance and apology. One note read, "I'm sorry we stopped looking." Another, scrawled on the back of a church bulletin, said, "The river gave him back." For many, the revelation shattered something they hadn't realized they were still holding on to, a belief that safety and familiarity protected them, that people didn't just disappear. But Thomas had, and now, painfully, he had returned. Reporters arrived again, this time not to speculate or chase rumors, but to document resolution. Interviews with the lead investigator, now a decade older, detailed the lessons learned. He admitted how incomplete the riverbed models had been back then, how hydrodynamic behavior had been underestimated. He spoke not with guilt, but humility, explaining how nature often works in ways that exceed even their best planning. The recovery wasn't a product of forensic brilliance, he said. It was chance, time and weather doing what people could not. The local news stations focused on the emotional arc. They played old footage from the initial search, volunteers sweeping the woods, helicopters overhead, yellowed flyers taped to street signs. They played it beside shots of Margaret and Lydia walking the riverbank again, older now, quieter, but finally stepping into the part of the story that had always been missing. The end. Commentators called it a tragedy, but also a story of perseverance, a reminder of how long grief can last, how hope can survive even without answers, and how sometimes, just sometimes, nature decides to answer after all. The town held a memorial 3 days later. It wasn't a funeral, Thomas had already been mourned in 100 different ways. This was something else, a ritual of recognition, of acceptance. Friends gathered near the trailhead, where a temporary plaque had been placed, etched with his name, birth year, and the words, "Returned to the river, but never lost." Margaret stood beside it with Lydia at her side. Thomas Jr., long absent from town, flew in the night before. He didn't speak. He only stood behind his mother, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the water as it moved past like it always had. Margaret placed a stone at the base of the sign. Lydia placed a second one. Dozens followed. It became a cairn built not of grief, but of memory. The river itself had changed. That final storm had carved away not just soil, but the illusion of permanence. Its banks were jagged now, its path slightly shifted. But for those who lived in Brighton Falls, the river had also become something else, a marker of time, of loss, and of reluctant truth. The community's relationship with it had been rewritten. No longer just a place of beauty or recreation, it was now a reminder that nature holds no malice, only mystery, that it can take without warning and return without reason, and that behind every missing person's face on a flyer, there is always a family still waiting, still walking the same trails, still listening to the wind for answers. For the Mallorys, the answers had finally come. Painful, unearned, but real. Thomas was gone, and they could finally say goodbye. Months after the storm that had rewritten the shape of the river and unearthed the mystery it had kept buried for over a decade, Brighton Falls began to settle back into its rhythms. The Mallory family, after finally laying Thomas to rest, returned to a quieter life, one filled not with unanswered questions, but with the slow work of healing. The case had been closed, the forensic reports filed, the memorial held, and for most the story was over. But for Lydia Mallory, something remained unresolved, not in what was found, but in what had been missed for so long. Closure, she'd learned, was not just about finding a body, it was about understanding why it was lost in the first place. It began with a file box, one of many stacked in the back room of the Brighton Falls Historical Society, a modest building tucked between the post office and the library. A volunteer archivist, a retired land surveyor named Dale Petrosky, was scanning old documents for digital preservation when he came across a fragile, oversized sheet folded between yellowing pages. The paper was thin and brittle, lined in faded blue ink and pencil notations. A 1972 hand-drawn topographic survey of the river, drafted decades before the modern trail system had been constructed. Dale, out of curiosity more than duty, compared the map to current GPS overlays and noticed something strange. Near the bend, where Thomas had been found, the map showed a narrow man-made structure, labeled Auxiliary Channel, Drainage Control. It was a small offshoot of the river, long since erased from memory in the modern landscape. He flagged the finding and contacted the county records office. Within days, a local engineer confirmed the historical map's legitimacy. The auxiliary drainage channel had been part of a short-lived flood diversion project in the early 70s. It was filled in after erosion concerns, and then forgotten entirely, no longer maintained, no longer visible. The path that now curved near that site, where Thomas walked nearly every day, ran directly over what had once been a wooden walkway used by city maintenance workers to access the channel. It was never part of the town's official trail system. When the channel was decommissioned, the structure was left in place and slowly buried under years of leaves, silt, and root growth. When this information reached the sheriff's department, they coordinated with structural engineers and archaeologists to re-examine the site. What they uncovered stunned everyone. Beneath the modern footpath, barely visible unless excavated, were the remains of an old platform, a lattice of rotting wood beams, nails rusted to dust, half swallowed by the soil. It had partially collapsed in multiple places, hidden beneath a thin crust of earth and overgrown moss. The shape and size matched exactly the position where Thomas Mallory's body had been found. One beam, jagged and caved in near the center, was consistent with the theory that he had stepped unknowingly onto the structure that morning in 2011. The platform hadn't given way with drama or noise. It had likely broken beneath him in slow silence, planks cracking just enough to tip his balance. No scream, no splash, just a drop into cold water and a forgotten architectural scar. The report was updated. Though it didn't change the cause of death, still ruled accidental drowning, it provided the final missing piece: the how. A detail so critical, so devastatingly simple that it shifted everything. This hadn't been an unpredictable act of nature alone. It had been man-made, a forgotten flaw buried in the land. Lydia read the updated report in the same chair where her father used to read the newspaper. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. She didn't cry, not right away. The devastation wasn't in the drama. It was in the silence, in the idea that something so preventable had stayed hidden for so long. If someone had remembered the bridge, if someone had marked the path, if even 1 foot of trail had been realigned, her father would have come home. When the Mallorys received the news, they grieved all over again, but this time with clarity. Margaret sat with the engineers at the site and asked them to show her exactly where it happened. She wanted to feel the soft patch of earth where the walkway once lay, to see the gap that had been there all along. She wanted to mark it not just with memory, but with knowledge. Thomas hadn't wandered. He hadn't fallen victim to crime, confusion, or chance. He had been taken by a moment, by one soft board, one misstep, one forgotten structure hiding beneath the routine of his life. The town responded quickly. A new sign was erected at the entrance to the trail, explaining both the history of the area and the importance of maintaining awareness of the river's evolving terrain. A historical marker was proposed to note the location of the lost drainage system. More than just a safety initiative, it was a kind of reckoning, an acknowledgement that places carry histories deeper than their surface. For Lydia, the finality didn't bring peace so much as weight. She knew now that her father had done nothing wrong. He hadn't chosen to disappear. He had walked the path like he always had, 1 foot in front of the other, trusting the land beneath him. And the land had given way. But that truth, while painful, was something she could finally live with. The river hadn't just held his body. It had held the moment a man stepped where memory had faded, where human construction had failed, and where time had conspired to erase warning. The storm had exposed more than remains. It had exposed that moment, and in doing so, it had ended the silence. What the river held was never just a mystery. It was an answer, waiting.